record, so you can feel free to say anything. So next slide, next slide, Tabla. So today we have a fantastic speaker. He's Dr. Evid Van Dorn. He will talk about the future regulation of ocean observing in the European Union. Eric works as research associate at the Walter Schacking Institute for International Law at Kiel University, where he has been teaching and researching international law. In his current research, Eric is focused on mineral and living research, the legal implication of ocean observing at UMR, and the legal aspects of marine uptake of carbon dioxide. So it's super interesting the topic that we have today. So welcome, Eric, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, and thanks very much for the kind invitation and introduction. I will just start sharing my screen. There we go. I guess it's in presenter mode now. So yes, I am part of the EuroC project, which is a project funded by the EU, and where we actually look at how to improve many things regarding ocean observing, one of them being the regulation. And might be interesting to mention that the European Marine Board is actually also a partner in this very project. So what I want to talk about today is, before I go into the regulatory framework in the EU, or as we will figure out, for what there is, so to say, because there isn't much, I'll give you an introduction on the international regulatory framework, which is also binding upon the EU. So I will present a little bit of that background, and then we can go into a question and answer session. But please also put any questions in the chat, or if you really don't understand, maybe raise your hand or something. Then I can explain it during the talk. And then we can even have, if there's time, we can have a discussion about how we actually should improve this whole regulatory framework, if there are any ideas out there in the audience. The idea behind it is, I'm not an oceanographer, so I am actually a lawyer by training, so I am not taking observations. That is, so what I'm going to say is about what kind of observations I know, or what kind of observations are taken, but you, probably there are some seagoing scientists among you, know probably better than I do how these observations are taken, and can have some ideas on how to improve the regulatory framework or the policies that apply, and you are also the best to know what kind of problems you normally ran into. So we can also try to address those. So to start, there's not really a particular framework in international law or in European Union law for ocean observing. So that means that a lot of different laws and international treaties do apply. What is normally covering a lot of what oceanographers do on the ocean is the Law of the Sea Convention, and this United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as its full name is already 40 years old. So it actually entered into force in 1994, but it was negotiated in the 1970s and concluded in 1982. So when the rules were written in this convention, which is binding upon 167 countries in the world, plus the European Union, they all ratified this treaty, so are then supposed to implement these laws into their national legislation. In the 1970s, the only way to take ocean observations was normally via research vessels. There is one part in the Law of the Sea Convention, part 13, that deals with marine scientific research. And this deals mainly with research vessels. So modern observations, instruments fall under these rules as well. This is the second bullet point. But these are, for example, floats, these are gliders, these are buoys, these are all kind of things that you do research with, which probably weren't even around when the rules were invented. So you can imagine that the rules are not always compatible with the actual conduct of ocean observing, simply because there has been so much technological development in the last 4 decades. So we can have a look at that, how that actually works. And don't forget that the purpose for which the data are collected is key from a regulatory framework. So it really matters what you use the data for afterwards. And then that's just one of the main issues that you have to keep in mind, but it's one of the ones that I wanted to put out here. So many of the ocean observations that we take would fall under that framework for marine scientific research, as I said already. Not all of them, however. So what I'm trying to do is to first explain to you what the regulatory framework for marine scientific research is, which would cover a lot of the ocean observations that we do. And then I will discuss on the slide thereafter what actually falls not under these rules, or where there's still discussion about that, because not everything is actually as clear as you might hope it would be. Don't forget the small print. So don't look at the yellow print on the figure to your right. That is not for now. The most important thing is that this is more or less what the Law of the Sea Convention came up with. It came up with a lot of things, to be honest. It has 17 parts, 320 articles. It's the largest international treaty ever to be negotiated. And it also is nicknamed the Constitution of the Oceans. In its first 11 parts, it actually divides the ocean up into different zones, and then it focuses on specific issues. For example, the protection and preservation of the marine environment in part 12. In part 13, as I mentioned already, the marine scientific research. Then part 14 deals with transfer of technology, not important for today. And part 15 deals with settlement of disputes, also not important for today. So what we are going to focus on is where do you take your observations and who can regulate those observations then. So the first thing that the Law of the Sea Convention does is giving the possibility to every state that is a party to this convention to claim a territorial sea up to 12 nautical miles from the baseline, which is from the coast, more or less. So up to 12 nautical miles, every state, coastal state, can claim a territorial sea. So where you see a capital M, that means nautical miles. And in this territorial sea, the coastal state is free to regulate marine scientific research, and therewith also most ocean observations. So when you are within this territorial sea of a coastal state, you are bound by the rules of this coastal state. Actually, you need explicit consent, according to the Law of the Sea Convention, in order to do research in that very area. The contiguous zone is not very important for the issues of marine scientific research, so forget about the next 12 nautical miles. But the next important one is actually the exclusive economic zone, which stretches, you also have to claim it, so if the states don't claim it, they don't have it, stretches to 200 nautical miles from that very same baseline. In this exclusive economic zone, the coastal state has exclusive rights over natural resources, which means mainly oil and gas and fisheries. That means, in a nutshell, that when you do research in that area, you also need consent of the coastal state. However, the coastal state has to have very good reasons to deny you that consent. It more or less can do that when you are doing research that directly relates to the exploitation of natural resources. So as soon as the coastal state thinks, these data that this person is, or this research vessel or whatever kind of instrument is actually collecting, that might be interesting for our natural resource development, then it could actually deny you access to the exclusive economic zone. And this is problematic, right? So we will see that a little bit later on. Then, because it's the coastal state that can decide this, researchers can argue, no, temperature doesn't, or salinity doesn't have anything to do with the fisheries resources, right? And but if the coastal state said, nah, we think it does, then it can actually deny your access. So that is in a nutshell what there. If we look at the sea floor, the coastal state is entitled to also have sovereign rights over its natural resources in its continental shelf. And its continental shelf has nothing to do with a geological continental shelf. No, there's also such a thing as a legal continental shelf. Complete nonsense from a natural science perspective. But this legal continental shelf stretches up to 200 nautical miles as well. So within these 200 nautical miles, no matter if there is a geological continental shelf or not, the same thing applies as what I just said about the exclusive economic zone. It becomes a little bit different when there is a geological continental shelf that actually extends beyond these 200 nautical miles. Then these yellow, the yellow small print is applicable. Very difficult rules listed in Article 76 of the Law of the Sea Convention if you want to read them. But I wouldn't, because it's really hard to understand. So let's assume for simplicity that there's no research going on the continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles. So on the high seas, so everything beyond the exclusive economic zone and beyond the continental shelf, it's a free-for-all, more or less, in many regards, but also when it comes to marine scientific research. So you don't need any consent from anybody if you do research on the ocean further than 200 nautical miles from any coast. Okay, so that's more or less it. Now to the exceptions. The Law of the Sea Convention decided that hydrographic surveys, or at least it hints at such a thing, it's not really explicitly said, but since it lists marine scientific research and hydrographic surveys, lawyers tend to think that hydrographic surveys do not fall under marine scientific research, which means that any research that is done for shipping, for example, so where are the rocks, how deep is the ocean there, and so on and so on and so on. These kind of things that are regularly done should not be hampered by any coastal state by saying, no, this is marine scientific research, you cannot do this. No, shipping is too important, so this is kind of exempted from coastal state jurisdiction. Jurisdiction is the legal word for power, more or less, right? So, or the jurisdiction to regulate, so they can not have rules applicable to that. I gave you already the second example. So again, rewind, I'll do it again. Resource-related research, so stock assessments, for example, when we talk about fisheries, but also drilling for oil and gas. So exploring, more or less, what is out there. That would be under the full jurisdiction of the coastal state when this happens within 200 nautical miles, right? That's what I said already. So when it relates to the possible exploitation or future exploitation of resources by the coastal state over which the coastal state has exclusive jurisdiction, right? Exclusive power, then this would actually be exempted from the whole scheme. Then it's fully within the power of the coastal state. Remote sensing, so if we look at satellites, this is not covered, or anything that flies over the ocean for that matter, this is not necessarily covered by the Law of the Sea Convention. So this does not mean marine scientific research. So what I would suggest, if I would be a lawyer and I would have to give you advice, if you can take data on the ocean, but the very same data you could also take from satellites, I don't even know if that's possible, take it with a satellite, because then you're not subject to this whole legal regime for the ocean. In outer space, the regulations are much different and much more akin to when you would do research on the high seas, so beyond national jurisdiction, beyond these 200 nautical miles. It's more or less a free-for-all. So satellite data you can easily collect, and the Law of the Sea does not apply. Some people have made the argument that marine scientific research also does not include regular ocean observations or sustained ocean observations, meaning those taken, for example, by Argo floats, or those taken by regular commercial ships that take data on whenever they cross a certain ocean. These so-called sustained observations are, and some countries argue this, would also be exempted from any coastal state jurisdiction, as I just explained on the slide before. In the United States, they came up with that term operational oceanography. These days, for example, the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOS, would rather use sustained ocean observations. And this is actually an idea that is also applied to a separate legal framework, which is applicable to Argo floats. And I will get to that in a little bit. Interestingly enough, this Law of the Sea Convention was negotiated by a whole lot of people, but there were, of course, some chairs who had a more important role and who moderated the whole discussion. The chair of the part that negotiated the law of the sea regarding marine scientific research, Alexander Yankov, who was a Bulgarian diplomat, he actually said, well, and this was due to a possible lobby by the World Meteorological Organization, any marine meteorological data or oceanographic measurements that are important for weather forecasts, so therefore important for the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, are also exempted from the framework that I just explained. With which argument, interestingly, they said weather forecasts can actually save lives. And therefore, this should not be hampered or hindered or played with by coastal states, right? You should have access to these data, to these measurements in the even in the coastal waters of a state. It becomes really interesting when we start talking about animal-borne sensors. So those little observations that are taken when you put a sensor on a seal, for example, or on a tuna, or I don't know what kind of things you can put a sensor on these days. Then it's really interesting. Are you then actually regulating the data, or are you just regulating the movement of the animal? And the movement of the animal, you can of course not regulate. We cannot influence that. But the conduct of ocean observations, that we want to regulate. It seems, however, that the animal has so-called preference, so to say. So it is also argued in the literature that animal-borne sensors would actually be a nice bypass of the system that I just told you. So not being subject to coastal regulation. So that's another idea. If you can put your sensor on a seal, that might actually be better than putting it on a glider or any kind of float or a buoy or something. If that would even work, right? But this would legally make more sense. Okay. Now to the EU. So this is the international legal framework. I will refer to that back and forth when we talk about EU things. There is a rule in the Law of the Sea Convention, Article 123, paragraph C, which says that states bordering an enclosed or semi-enclosed sea should cooperate to coordinate, among other things, right? They have to do a lot, but to coordinate their scientific research policies and undertake, where appropriate, joint programs of scientific research. Whatever this means is not defined. Don't forget, it's the constitution of the ocean, right? So it doesn't regulate everything. You need some additional rules sometimes, but it is an encouragement, at least, for certain groups of states to actually regulate their scientific research policy. And it might also be an encouragement for the EU. The EU is the only non-state entity that is actually also a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. So all its member states are a party, but the EU itself is also a party to the Law of the Sea Convention. Don't ask me why, but that's how it is. So that also means that the EU itself, Brussels, so to say, is bound by the Law of the Sea Convention. Now, the EU has generally 3 different kinds of competences, just to explain that a little bit, in order to know, can they actually regulate ocean observations? Can they actually regulate the conduct of ocean observations? Because how is that done? For certain things, the EU has exclusive competence. So only the EU can regulate this and not the member states. So the member states gave away all their power to regulate something to the EU, to Brussels. That's the so-called exclusive competence. This would, for example, be the case for the internal market. So for anything economic, anything trade, like within the EU. The second thing is shared competence. So normally the EU would have competence here, but in certain issues, it can actually share its competence with the member states. So the member states also still have a say, which would not be the case with exclusive competence. And in some areas, it actually supports whatever the member states do. So even a lower level of interference of the EU. So it can help member states to regulate something, but it does not regulate something itself. Or if so, then it would not be binding. Now we have to figure out where ocean observations is, and there's a little bit of a different argument here, because here it's important, what do you actually use your ocean observations for? What do you use the data for, right? So some people have argued, and this is probably would not be agreed upon by the member states of the EU, but some people have argued, well, if these data as a result of ocean observations actually feed into the internal market, so to the trading mechanisms within the EU, then the EU should also have exclusive competence about this. The member states would probably not agree. They really are protective of whatever powers they still have, right? So member states would probably say, no, not really. We'll figure out however in a couple of minutes what we can do about this. There have been some pushes in the EU to start looking into this. Often they talk about marine scientific research, sometimes they talk about ocean observations. So there have been the integrated maritime policy, which is the policy that regulates, or one of the standard policies that regulates anything maritime in the EU, has developed some cross-sectoral initiatives. It is mostly there to support sustainable economic growth. Don't forget that the EU is mainly an economic entity, right? And it also is there to promote the protection of the marine environment. It also looks at maritime spatial planning, which we won't go into detail now. But one of the interesting things it says in this integrated maritime policy is that there should be initiatives of the member states to co-finance, purchase, and maintain marine observation systems and technical tools for designing, setting up, and running an operational European Marine Observation and Data Network System, EMODNet, which aims to facilitate the collection, acquisition, assembly, processing, quality control, reuse, and distribution of marine data and knowledge through cooperation between member states and or international institutions concerned. So there's some encouragement to do something about this, right? And there's more. The integrated maritime policy came from the European Commission, which is kind of the executive body of the European Union. In 2018, the European Parliament came up with a very long resolution about the ocean, and I picked out some paragraphs that might be interesting. Extending existing EU research on observations and observation tools and activities, including that EMODNet that I mentioned already, in order to establish a shared database, the European Earth Observation Program, Copernicus, right? Well, now we're all of a sudden talking with a connection to satellites, and the European Global Ocean Observing System, EuroC. It also aims for facilitating knowledge of the seabed, marine species and habitats, and of gathering geological, bathymetric, seismic, volcanic, chemical, hydrological, atmospheric, and meteorological data on the oceans. This is interesting because it's only if you are on the oceans, in order to take atmospheric data, this is not considered marine scientific research. So it's only considered marine if you actually do research on the ocean. And you are on the ocean itself, remember? Because if you're in outer space and you do research on the ocean, then again, it's not marine scientific research. So the coastal state can also not say much about it. It should also strengthen, the EU itself, should strengthen mapping, observations, and research in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Atlantic. And that comes a little bit back to the first thing I put up here, that on, that on enclosed seas and semi-enclosed seas, there's an additional encouragement to actually cooperate among states. So what has the EU done? Not very much, but a couple of years ago, actually in my view, as a reaction to this resolution of Parliament, the Commission started their so-called Ocean Observing Initiative, which means they can more or less ask around to stakeholders, how can we actually improve these issues? And one of the few things that the Commission pointed out themselves was that there's now, within the member states, a split responsibility between departments, and not only at the national level, but also at an EU level. Which means if we talk ocean observations, which department are we? This can differ on the national level, right? Different ministries can have an influence. Sometimes it's the Ministry of the Oceans, if you have such a thing. Portugal has such a thing, for example. Sometimes it's the Ministry of Economics, right? Of the economy. Sometimes it's the Ministry of Education and Research. Sometimes it's the Environmental Ministry. So, and so on and so on and so on. In the EU, you would have, for example, if we deal with ocean observing, is this within Directorate General, DG Mare, which deals with the oceans, or is it within DG Research and Development, or is it within DG Environment, or within DG Climate? So all of these might have something to say about it, and that makes it more difficult. So the EU seems to want to do something about it. What they also complain about is that there's no coordination between different consortia, and they mean research consortia, so different groups of researchers that get together. This is not completely true because they actually do talk to each other. And I don't know why the European Commission missed that, but they wanted to point it out there. According to the stakeholders then that were asked, I was also involved with the EuroC project that I'm part of. A lot of things came back, right? So a lot of people complained about the ocean observing system, saying there's inefficient planning, there's opaque planning sometimes, there's insufficient sharing of data. So not actually the ocean not on the side of the ocean observing itself, but on the data side. There's insufficient innovation and there's unsustainable observation, meaning we need more sustainable ocean observing in order to get more sustained data sets over time. And this is not regulated at all, and it might be interesting for the EU to get in there. So according to the Commission, we need a baseline. And if we go for a directive, this would be one way to regulate and to improve this regulation within the EU. This directive would aim for member states to bring all public bodies responsible for ocean observation together to develop priorities, realize opportunities for sharing effort, speak with an agreed voice at an EU level, and facilitate coherence at a sea basin level. And that sea basin level comes then back to the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the North Sea, the Baltic, and so on. A regulation would do similar things, but this is more uniform and it's simpler to implement. And you could also actually do this through soft law. So a directive and a regulation would be legally binding on the member states, so they have to implement it. Whereas a soft law, this could be principles. It could be a code of conduct, which is not binding, but it's more a suggestion, so to say, is what they call soft law. And something similar, the Commission said with EU funding to support observations of a common benefit. So the likely impacts from improving ocean observing regulations would be environmental, social, economic. It would simplify things, right? If you harmonize this among Europe, and it would have a lesser administrative burden. What is the idea behind this? One of the ideas is that if you are now, for example, let's say I'm in Germany and I want to do ocean observing in the Belgian EEZ, exclusive economic zone. Now, I would have to go through the exact same process of applying for consent, right? For if it might relate to resources and so on and so on and so on. At least I have to notify Belgium, right, and ask for consent. If they don't say anything within a couple of months, I can go ahead and do my research, Article 246 of the Law of the Sea Convention. But I still have to do it, right? You all know that when you go out on a research cruise, you have to ask for these permissions in order to get consent to do ocean observation. If I go to Belgium, or if I go to Brazil, or if I go to the United States, it doesn't matter. I still have to go through the same procedure. And one of the ideas would be, hey, can we not simplify this within the EU? We regulate so many things together. Can we not make it easier? Because sometimes some states are really strict, right? I heard from researchers from France, for example, that even if you are from France and you want to do a research cruise with a French vessel in French waters, you still need to apply for consent. Right. So for French people, it doesn't matter if they do research in France or in Belgium, they would still have to go through the same process. So is there no way of harmonizing that within the EU, making this easier? And then you get all these advantages, if you would do such a thing, that the Commission actually lists here. So the idea is, if we want to achieve these things, we want to know better who does these informations, who does these regulate these ocean observations. If we want to know where we need to go, for example, in Germany, then we want to have maybe one office, and marine scientific research clearing office or something, where we can go, right? If you want to do research in German waters, you don't want to have to figure out, where do I actually have to apply? Where should I go? Which ministry should I go? Which office should I go? Which agency should I go? And even if that is organized, then you want to have that actually well known. So if we want to have certain improvements, and these improvements, which I will list in a little bit, there's different way of doing this. The Commission seems to be on board, although I heard last week actually that the initiative, as I just presented from the Commission, is a bit dormant. So there's not much happening at the moment. I think the Parliament is also on board, which is a good idea, right? Because the 2018 resolution, they really push for harmonization of conduct of ocean observing. The Council, however, which also needs to agree on any kind of regulation. So in a nutshell, how this goes when you regulate something in the EU, the European Commission proposes something, a draft, and they sends this to the Parliament and the Council. And the Parliament and the Council need to agree upon this and can actually reiterate between the two of them. So what we need is we have a Commission proposal, which is dormant at the moment. Then we would need the Parliament on our side, which is probably going to happen, but we also need the Council on our side. And the Council is the biggest problem because that's where the member states are. And the member states are very protective of whatever they can regulate. If they say, for example, no, we regulate this ourselves, there's no need for the EU to do this, then we run into trouble, right? Then they can actually block whatever decision is going to be taken. In order to put this even on the agenda, but don't forget, it's not even on the agenda yet, right? We need different ways of doing this. And what we are trying now is to influence certain working parties. These are little committees that hang under the Council, where the member states are represented, and we try to convince them that this is an important issue. This is something that actually is important. Ocean observing, we need to have this harmonized because we need it in order to achieve the Paris Agreement. We need it in order to achieve a new agreement on biological diversity in oceans beyond national jurisdiction. We need it for a lot of reasons. And at the moment, it's hampered by the very old framework that we have. So we need to convince them that this is a good idea. And the presidency of this council changes every half a year. Next month coming up is Sweden for half a year, then it's Spain, I think, and then it's Belgium in the first half of 2024. And we thought that these three states might actually be interested in pushing for something. And the president of these working parties, so these committees that advise the council on what they should do or not, can actually then be influenced. At least that is what we hope for. What you will always hear from member states is the principle of subsidiarity. What does that mean? The principle of subsidiarity actually means that in the EU, you need to regulate something at the lowest possible level. So that means if you can regulate something locally, for example, planting a tree in the park which is next to your house, of course, the city council is going to deal with that. If you need to have a road which leads to your next the next town around, then it's probably the provincial government that deals with that. Taxes might be different levels, right? But also the federal level. The EU can only regulate something when it makes sense to do this on the EU level. And I think personally that we can push for something because of the examples that I just gave, that the EU should regulate these kind of things. So in order to get around this coastal states consent, and these are my examples, and then I will quit. In order to get around these coastal state consent that you would need, right, where you always have to apply, even if it doesn't relate to resources, then the state still has to acknowledge that, the coastal state. Why not have bilateral or regional agreements where you actually say, hey, it's some kind of automized, right, where I want to go from Germany to the Belgian exclusive economic zone, and we have a standard agreement already that we can actually do this. Nowadays, you have to apply 6 months in advance, which is sometimes really difficult, especially if you work with gliders or with floats or with any kind of buoys or something. Things that go with the current, even animal-borne sensors, right? You have no idea where they are in 6 months from now. So in order to have this harmonized, in order to have a system for that, we actually would need some kind of acknowledgement or consent in advance by what we would call an MSR, Marine Scientific Research Clearance Office. There's many inconsistencies, this is number 3, in coastal state regulations. So between different coastal states, there's very different regulations. Why not use a standardized form for the application? Because now you would have to use a different form depending on the state where you want to go. Such a standard form is there already from the United Nations Secretariat, the Division of Ocean Affairs and the Law of the Sea. They have such a standard form. It's publicly available on the web. Why not use that? We would, interestingly, marine scientific research is not defined under the Law of the Sea Convention. So we have no idea what it exactly means. So why don't we give some hints and say we focus on essential ocean variables, which are defined by the Global Ocean Observing System, GOOS. And we say, okay, if you want to take this EOV, then this regulation would apply. This is something we could achieve within the EU. So we need a harmonization of policies, that the principle of subsidiarity I talked already about. There are some advantages is if you are an international organization and you want to do research somewhere else. If any member of that international organization, in a nutshell, then wants to do research, it's kind of automated that you can do this research. We could use EMODnet, which was mentioned a couple of times before, already before this. And Article 123, paragraph C, which I showed you, which is about those enclosed and semi-enclosed seas, right? This would actually extend coverage also of any EU rules to any littoral states of European seas. So this would be the Baltic, this would be the North Sea, this would be the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, for example. Okay, this is the last part. The problem is now that Article 258 of the Law of the Sea Convention actually says, whenever new instruments are going to be invented, the current rules will apply. And we know, of course, that this doesn't work with actually gliders and floats, for example, because we don't know 6 months in advance which coastal waters they are actually going to enter. I mentioned the EOVs already. I won't go into customary international law. These are the unwritten rules, but that's too much for now. What we can actually try is, if we want to improve stuff, to push for things at the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, because remember, they are exempted from any of these coastal state regulations, because the meteorological data are supposed to save lives. I think that same argument could actually be made for climate data, right? Climate data would also save lives in the meantime. Probably not known 4 decades ago, but now for sure. There is a draft convention on the legal status of ocean data acquisition systems, ODAS for short, aids and devices, but this has been dormant also for a while. We could also revive that and see whatever separate convention we could actually take. Okay, that's it. My questions to you, if you have any input for these kind of things. I saw that there's some kind of things in the chat going on already. I will have a look at that now. What can be improved on EU level, and what can be improved maybe on the national or even local level? How can the EU facilitate this? And do you think any of the proposals that I just made would be feasible to do so? Okay, that was it from my part. I'll stop sharing